Persona 6's trailer is vague, eerie, and feels remarkably like classic SMT, and I love it. Especially when paired with a description from the Xbox store page, which reads, "Live a double life in modern-day Japan. Navigate the rhythms of everyday school life, build friendships, pursue romances, and cultivate memories that matter. But beneath the surface of familiar streets and quiet neighborhoods lies something darker. Strange rumors, unsettling urban legends, and occult incidents that only you and your closest allies can face. Persona 6 promises the perfect entry point into one of gaming's most beloved franchises for newcomers, and a haunting, profound new mystery for those who have been waiting." I repeat, haunting, profound new mystery for those who have been waiting. So we have a Persona game that is seemingly going back closer to the roots of SMT with a heavy focus on the occult, urban legends, and possibly some conspiracy theories as well. If you are like me and really resonate strongly with their portrayal in early games, that alone is enough to attract a lot of optimism for this game. Persona 3 began to move away from those roots, Persona 4 completely abandoned them, and Persona 5 made a lot of tributes to them. And now it's looking like Persona 6 is outright returning to them, which could mean a lot of potential. Now, personally, I didn't mind too much Persona becoming its own thing. Persona 4 is my favorite Persona game, and I do think that it is great in part because it decided to do its own thing, independent of the rest of the franchise. Because that gave P4 the freedom to explore an entirely new theme, setting, and conception that showed that Persona has the fluidity to not be bogged down by mainline and should also demonstrate vice versa as well. Now, having said that, I do generally resonate more with the occult, and thus am happy that the series has not completely forgone that potential. Especially given that I found Atlus's other recent games to be quite barren in that department. If I'm not mistaken, there are a few urban legends that happen to be true, that as in they happen in the story, and are relevant to the plot are only mentioned in passing during the early hours of SMT5, and that's the extent of any occultism and its potential in that game. It has a bit of aesthetic occultism, but that's besides the point. It doesn't really feel like it's really an occult game. SMT5 feels like it is a more generic JRPG in a lot of ways. A lot of the time when I think of SMT5, I think wasted potential broadly speaking, and even the canon of Vengeance is not immune to this issue, since while it is an overall improvement in every respect, that doesn't mean that it was immune to the issues of missed potential, because it did try and conform itself to the original in some respects. But that's for another time. Back to Persona 6, what really clinches it for me is the new teaser trailer. Like I said at the beginning of the video, it's vague, eerie, and feels remarkably like classic Shin Megami Tensei. But what I find to be extra special about the teaser was the atmosphere that it conveyed. I've said this before, but one of the things that I feel makes the 2000s the golden age for Atlus games was the atmosphere, especially when it came to Nocturne and Digital Devil Saga. But neither Persona games were necessarily a slouch either. P3 is the most surreal game that I've ever played in terms of visuals. And while more toned down, there is something to be said for the quirkiness in Persona 4's strong contrast between reality and the TV world, which really fits that story too. But it's also something that became a lower priority after the shift to the 3DS primarily, where less powerful hardware meant that sacrifices had to be made to get the games on the same consoles that Pokemon called home. Admittedly, I can't comment on the Persona Q games as I have yet to play those, and Strange Journey managed it pretty well, but I don't think that it would be controversial to say that the 3DS games are nowhere near as atmospheric as the PS2 entries, even if some standout instances and locations do exist, like the Fairy Forest Inn for Apocalypse. And upon the return to consoles, Atlus felt pretty out of practice and not quite able to tackle the atmosphere in the way that they once had. While it has its moments, Persona 5 I felt struggled with its atmosphere when compared to P3 and 4, and it's probably the one area where those two were more impressive visually. SMT5 seemed to especially struggle with atmosphere, given how bland and disjointed the general open world area felt. And even the new area for the canon of Vengeance, while better, still didn't quite capture the same sense of immersion that I got from the war-torn Junkyard or barren Vortex world. Soul Hackers 2 is kinda disjointed as well, given that the characters are dressed as VTubers, while the areas are more down-to-earth, creating a dissonance that honestly at times feels more funny and distracting than immersive and engaging. And I've certainly complained at length about how Reload didn't capture the off-kilter Soul Taker-esque atmosphere of the original P3 in the cutscenes already. This makes the fact that P6 is trying to go so heavy on the atmosphere for this teaser really invigorating. Like, they are trying to not only create something great, but to go all out and engage with the fans for one of the recurring criticisms of recent installments. Atmosphere was certainly one of the biggest criticisms that people had with Reload after all, and now it looks like Atlus is taking care to make their games have that much applauded atmosphere of the PS2 era. And as someone who felt so immersed in the PS2 SMT games because of this trait, seeing that on full display in a game that realistically would have sold well even without that ingredient, and may even repel some who don't mesh with it, engenders a lot of optimism on my end. So yeah, those two things, the occult synopsis and the atmosphere in the teaser, is what currently has me incredibly psyched for Persona 6. Matter of fact, this is the most excited that I've felt for a video game release since the 2021 release of Shin Megami Tensei 5, which was close to 5 years ago now. Now, before I wrap this video up, I'd like to bring up a few bullet points that I have about the teaser. Firstly is, of course, the graveyard and barren trees. Shin Megami Tensei translates into English as True Goddess Reincarnation or Metempsychosis, the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, which is often a core component of SMT games. In that vein, I'm not so sure that the use of a graveyard implies being dead as a plot point, as some have speculated on, but rather I'm wondering if this is more metaphorical and representing a death without a rebirth sort of scenario. I'm reminded of the words of Katsura Hashino back during the development of Persona 3, and about how he was inspired by the ongoing war in Afghanistan that Japan felt relatively untouched by. And so he decided he'd make a game that tackles ideas of mortality and what happens when catastrophe was set to strike, particularly to a populace that felt relatively safe and isolated from said catastrophe. Or to use his own words, why don't you try dying once? In which case, is the graveyard meant to be a more spiritual or metaphorical death, like maybe the classic trope of a character with amnesia, or perhaps someone who'd had something taken and so feels like a part of them has been killed, and maybe retaking that is what awakens them to their persona? It would certainly explain the headless statue, I think. Part of them is dead and so lays to rest, while the shadow is whoever has died, as it were, grasping for what they have lost. That's a good segue into the headless statue as well, because while I do think that this is probably going to be metaphorical, the question should be asked, is this going to be a major character or a major mystery? Is that what the statue represents instead? Because while I think that the graveyard is metaphorical, the statue may not be. Because the statue, I feel, is a bit more likely to represent a character or a plot beat. I'm talking a good chunk about metaphors here, I know, but I'd like to remind you that the first P5 trailer was similarly largely metaphorical, and I don't think that it's unlikely for the teaser of P6 to be likewise. The final two things that I want to go over are the collage face and the pointing fingers, which personally remind me of Danganronpa's iconic finger pointing. But notable is that one of the pointing arms in the scenes that include them are red. Blood red. Now, SMT has made frequent use of color in its symbolism before, and red is the color of many things, but in the context of SMT specifically, it is the color of the Chaos Alignment, while white is the color of neutrality, or else those demons who are unaffiliated with either factions. So, is the red arm representing a Chaos element trying to rally humanity against other humans or the law alignment? And what about the face made with a collage of what looks like magazine snippets and cutouts? Is that going to be plot relevant? Personally, I think this is probably just an inventive portrayal of a Jungian persona myself. But what do you think of these images and what they potentially mean as allegories? And do you, like me, get a bit of 2000s flashback when looking at them? Things like collages and finger pointing aren't something decade specific, obviously, but it was during the 2000s that these images were signifiers in marketing, which goes back to what I said earlier about the 2000s being Atlus's golden age. Even outside of SMT specifically, since we had Trauma Center on the 3DS. Remember, a lot of the fresher employees are those who grew up with those classic games, and maybe right now there's a push to resurrect the classics 2000-styled Atlus games for Persona 6 at least. Now, obviously, this has been a sentiment for a while, given that Atlus has been trend-chasing older games quite a bit for the past few installments, in fact. But Persona 6 has the potential to not really copy the feel or attitude of one game, but rather the general sense of a generation, which I think could work a lot better as a return to form if that's what Atlus is trying to pursue, at least more so than trying to emulate previous ones without really understanding what made them special. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there for the time being. Let me know what makes you excited about Persona 6 in the comments section if you'd be so kind. And one last thing before I disembark. A leaker has mentioned that it is not impossible for Persona 6 and Persona 4 Revival to both come out next year. So here's hoping for a late 2027 release and some more concrete information after P4RE has been released to the waiting public. Anyway, on screen right now will be last week's video on why I'm not excited for Persona 4 Revival, as well as something else recommended to you by the algorithm. And speaking of Persona 6, next week's video is going to be 6 potential forms for the Velvet Room to assume in the upcoming Persona 6. So subscribe and turn on notifications to make sure that you get videos as soon as they're ready. Until that time comes, I'm going to wish everybody a happy rest of your week, and here's to a hopefully fantastic Persona 6.